So what we're going to do, since there's so many different rabbit holes that we could go down, is I'm going to try to explain as much as possible just 2 of these canvases. And we'll hold off on sort of questions and discussions to the end, because I can imagine like one question from any of you could send this off into like 20 minutes. And I'll try to keep, for those of you who need to be here, only 30 minutes and have to get back to work, you have a limited time. I'll try to sort of pack in stuff. And then if anybody wants to stay, we can discuss, we can go look at other paintings, delve the mysteries. I also got some weird stomach virus this morning, so I'm actually not very stable on my pins, so we'll see how this works out. So the title of this tour, what I'm titling it is Mysticism as Information Design. And so I wanted to think about and talk about this tradition within mysticism, but it's also consummately scientific, of just mapping what constitutes reality. So, one innovation that we forget is an innovation in the history of consciousness and the history of language was, early on somebody came up with the idea that there were 4 elements, right? Air, fire, water, the earth is the other one, right? So, but as we know, these are elaborate fictions. Something like fire needs both air and earth in order to combust. Something like the air has water in it, and sometimes when there's a lightning storm, there is also fire, which we know now is electricity. So, a lot of early, especially the Greek philosophers, really troubled over these divisions. And for example, they thought, well, there's the air, but maybe there is this enchanted double of the air called the ether. And in many ways, the word air is etymologically linked to the word for ether. It's spelled the same way if you transliterate it from Greek, at least the beginning of it. There were theories of the idea of the pneuma, the idea that somehow the pneuma of our soul was a mixture of breath and fire, or just the idea of the spiritus, from which we get the word spiritual, was an idea of the breath that courses through everything. It was literally just that, a kind of almost like a mystified air. Now, these are all compelling but inadequate models, we know, for reality. So in fact, we have, in the end of the 19th century, we came up with all the elements, and there's still more elements to sort of map out. And somebody like Lucretius, who we'll talk about later on, was fed up with people like Heraclitus, who, for example, said that everything was fire. He just thought that was a little bit of a stupidity to say that sort of all elements were composed of fire, or that there was some sort of prime element like the ether that controlled and infused all things. Now, the thing is, though, is that we have to think about, well, what are the tools that we have to map out these elements of reality, to sort of think about the divisions between the sort of multiple elements and the multiplicity of the real world? Well, up to a certain point, it was mostly language and philosophy. So for thousands of years, philosophers, work this out with the word. Now, when we have different technologies of the word as combined with the image, we have different possibilities. So one of the first images here, this is a sort of famous image from Robert Fludd, Integrae Naturae Speculum Artisque Imago, which, if I remember, means the whole of nature, the whole mirror of nature and the image of art, or something like that. And so it was an attempt through not only text but also image to map out the known world and to think about the various divisions within that world and how they relate to some grander scheme. This was only possible through the advances in copperplate technology at the time. You have to think about, for example, how this made these mystical / scientific ideas available to a wider, perhaps illiterate public. We also have to remember that at this time, mysticism and science was basically one and the same. There wasn't the same sort of division that we have that came later in the Enlightenment, when Enlightenment philosophers tried to get rid of alchemy. although from what we know in the history of science, even somebody like Newton, who we think of as a consummate empiricist, a consummate rationalist, was still enamored of the insights that are within alchemy. And so there was always this kind of haunted double to scientific progress. There was always something pulling science back into the irrational, and this is something that's very interesting to me. Now, if you look at this, we have, again, we could talk about any of these images for a long period of time. Think about how this image, what it implies for the creation of an artwork. It is the image of art, and they may be thinking of art in a much more expanded way, almost like natural history. But also, we see this little monkey in the middle that is, in some ways, us. It's the idea that we are, a lot of times this image is used to show the importance of mimesis at a certain point in time in the history of art, the idea that the role of art was to copy nature, and so the artist was just an ape of nature trying to replicate forms in nature by meditating on this system. We see different levels of reality, and when we get to this image, we'll also talk about the various hierarchies that we have here that are all linked together. But in some ways, we see the ape is connected to this alchemical virgin, is connected to this sort of higher Kabbalistic divinity. So there's some sort of access that the ape has to the whole thing, but yet it's enchained. So it's at once a kind of freedom to explore this whole universe, but also one is enchained in what they call the great chain of being, the catena aurea of existence. So, here's one example of, and if we look down here, we have the mineral world, the vegetable world, the animal world, the different spheres of the stars and the different elements. If you look more closely, even the angels have their different divisions, different types of angels. At the very far reaches of this map, you have angels with just heads. Below that, you have angels with heads and wings and feet as well. And then you have just bodies floating in space. So as you go from the higher to lower, you get sort of more and more, or less and less divine, let's say. Now, if we look at this image, we have a similar idea or a similar image of moving from the lowest, the lowest reality, or I'm going to put lowest in quotes, to the highest, the one absolute life. However, even though it seems like a ladder, even though it seems hierarchical, it really isn't. Now, there's always within images like this a kind of metaphor with the body. So like a chakra map where you're sort of going from the sort of like the lower chakras up through the higher chakras. There's this metaphor between the energetics of the body and this meditation from sort of lower to higher realms and sort of raising the energy up through that system. However, and if we look at the next image, and this is from Theosophy, and the technology here that Ledbetter is probably being inspired by is the radio waves and X-rays and all the invisible rays of the late 19th century that influenced the Theosophists. But here he's talking about, here he has these levels of reality, and the physical is way down low there, and there's all these immaterial realms up in the higher echelons of this image. But he titles this involution and evolution. And the distinction between involution and evolution is really important for deconstructing this hierarchy. Because what it essentially means is that if we're going from the Heil at the bottom here, Heil is temporality, spatiality as Heil. The Heil is basically just the Greek word for matter. And in fact, the very translation of Heil to matter sort of instigates all these sort of philosophical conflicts about what we conceive of as the material world. But nevertheless, so you have Heil, which is kind of it's related to the word for forest. It means forest. It also relates to a kind of non-being. So as we sort of go from this utter materiality up through, here we have sort of a very interesting array of, types of narrative reasoning, let's say, connected to different forms of time on the left. And then we have types of signification linked to different types of spaces on the right. And then we get up to the top, which is eidos, which is a word in Greek philosophy that is connected to image, is connected to the ideal, is connected to form, and so on and so on. So we could say that below here is the physical world, and above this is a kind of metaphysical world that we can't necessarily really conceive with our human brain. And the leap here is this utopia, the lens of utopia, as he calls it. He sort of talks in his writing a lot about this leap from the 4 to the 5 and what that means. But the idea of involution implies that you're not just going from lower to higher realms, that somehow the higher is within the lower and the lower is within the higher. In many ways, certain people, one of the things, one thing I Wikipedia'd is that Simone de Beauvoir thought involution was a uniquely feminine idea. And I want to invite you to use Wikipedia when you come in here and sort of bringing your phones, because you're going to, there's a lot of information, a lot of interesting information that you can get out of, and you can hypertext out of these various images. So the idea that, for example, and this is going to be, I don't know if I can really necessarily untangle this, but within eidos, there's nothing magic about magic. And that's the point of these images. The idea that in order to get to these higher realities, it's a consummately material process. And so going from the hyal to the eidos, it's always somewhat hylistic, let's say. You're always dealing with the intractabilities of matter. Similarly, eidos, or the ideal, is implicit in the notion of hyal. And as we'll see with Lucretius, the idea, sort of what is your image of matter? What is the image of the primal bodies that constitute reality? Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, it's already almost out of time. So let's see. One thing also to keep in mind with this image is that it's very much influenced, as are a lot of these canvases, by, and I say canvases, which I hesitate to say paintings, because one of the things that I think is really interesting, and also I would say very holistic about these paintings, is that they use kind of amateur tools for creating this image, right? These are kind of like stick-on letters that you can find at Walgreens, right? And I almost get the sense that that the paint almost seems like house paint, right? And so this idea is kind of, it's important to the tradition of outsider art, and I wouldn't want to hypothesize too much about this without actually having the facts, but this idea of using everyday materials and using everyday tools to create these sort of fantastical arrays of or thought forms is very interesting. One thing that's also important to note about this is that, well, how have scientists thought about this leap from 4 to 5 and onward? How do we actually wrap our mind around, so we kind of know what list, anecdote, tale, legend, myth, and maybe we know what epiphany is, and then these forms of time, eternity, time, durance, succession, interval, and the instant. But how do we imagine hyparxis, cratophany, synergy, dinergy, hierophany, metatime, zeit, and on the other side, realm, metaspace, void, vos solid, solvid. I love the fact that there are 3 different ciphers here: SY, PHER, SI, PHER, and CY, CI, and CY, PHER. One of the things that's important to note, if you sort of look down at the bottom of the people who influenced Laffoley, the majority of them are fourth dimensional theorists from the 19th century. So there was a point in time in the 19th century where mathematicians were trying to think about this idea of the fourth dimension as time, but as a kind of time beyond time, a time beyond mechanistic time, a time that we couldn't actually basically wrap our brains around. There's an image, third image, or maybe it's it's actually the last image here. Claude Brangden, whose name is down here, thought that, so if we imagine on the right-hand side we have these cubes that are intersecting a plane. Well, as they intersect the plane, they create shapes that are nothing like the cube. And one of the metaphors that they would always use was that, well then, let's transpose that onto fourth dimensionality. Here we have a three-dimensional form intersecting a two-dimensional plane. This is the same thing that happens when a fourth dimensional form enters into our three-dimensional world. It has some sort of a shape, but that shape is only a kind of trace or index of fourth dimensionality. It's not fourth dimensionality itself. So these kind of blank spaces here, metaspace, realm, void, Volsolid, this is coming right from the Tesseract of Claude Brangden, are ways to think about how these shapes intersect the two-dimensional plane, but it's coming from, it's basically a representation or a cipher of something that can't be put into this plane. One thing that I discovered as I was looking through this was that Zollner, who I hadn't heard of before, another fourth dimensional theorist slash spiritualist, he would have these seances, and he would try to conjure up the ghost of Mobius, the guy who created the Mobius strip, so who worked at the same university but had been dead for a long time. Let's go on to the next painting. All right, so remember we were talking about the idea that there's nothing magic about magic, and one important figure for this is Lucretius in the De Rerum Natura, a very important early text for what we think of as materialist philosophy. The idea that there's only atoms and void comes from his text. The idea that the primal body of reality is the atom, and this came from Epicurean philosophy, came from Democritus. It was not only materialist, but it was also anti-religious and anti-superstition. And so one modern, I don't know if anybody's read Chesterton, he's a fiction writer, but he's also a Christian philosopher. He said something to the effect of, when Christ was killed on the cross, it was, I'll read it directly. In the lightning flash of this incident, we see great Rome going downward under her Lucretian doom. So this idea that the ideas of Lucretian were sort of, were so heretical because materialist is part of this idea that the very sort of, crucifixion of Christ came about through these philosophies that were seen as somehow pagan or backward. So, but there is a kind of strange hope within materialism, and one of the things that we can see in this, one of the paradoxes, is that even though it's anti-religion and anti-superstition, we have these images of Venus and Mars. And one of the paradoxical things about De Rerum Natura is that it starts with an invocation of Venus, even though it's anti-superstition and anti-God. So this is a very interesting move that he makes. It's something that one has to do in epic poetry. There's this tradition of the invocation of the muse. But maybe it's to imply that there's still some kind of miracle in the system, some sort of sense that love powers things to such a point that she can sort of conquer Mars, the god of war, in this image. So that seems very interesting to me. Look as well at the way in which these dots are arrayed within the canvas. You have a very sort of strict, let's say, a kind of sort of square format of the atoms. And then you have this more wild activity here. And in some ways, this is the miracle of the system. How, out of atoms and void, does anything come into being? And this is why the importance of the clinamen comes into being. And you see here this sort of, it's a clinamen, or also known as kind of atomic swerve is how it's described. Here he equates it to a form of free will. So into the system of atoms and void, there is a kind of swerve. And out of that swerve is how the universe is constituted. So it's a radically emergent idea that out of nothing, something comes into being. Even though Lucretius is famous as saying, as did Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, nothing comes from nothing, right? So this particular canvas is interesting to me because to me it's about poetry. And the idea of clinamen is an idea that is within the literary movement called Oulipo, a movement that's very interested in constraints and mathematics and sort of forms that don't really hold to any form of inspiration or lyric effusion, what they called the literature of eructation, writing a poem as if it's just a sort of, burp. So they were very interested in this sort of strict mathematical materialist form of writing. So for example, a lipogram would be an Oulipo technique where you would write a novel with a letter or a series of letters removed that you would never use, and that would be the constraint. So the Oulipo had to come up with an idea where, like, well, yes, we can sort of hold to these constraints, but there's these moments where we break from the constraint. There's this moment where we can't be fully, rigidly indebted to the constraint we've placed on the text, and this is where this idea of clinamen comes in. This is this idea of something that emerges, a creativity emerges even out of that is resolutely uncreative or scientific. Again, I mentioned that this. I think this has a lot to do with poetry. You have down here the dactylic hexameter. Laffoley was a classicist, so this is something you do as a classicist. You do all the time, is you sort of like scan out dun 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 dun. It's all over epic poetry. It is the meter of epic poetry, and was the meter of De Rerum Natura. So this idea of like how, and within De Rerum Natura, Lucretius makes really interesting connections between atoms and alphabet. That there is some kind of connection between the primal body of reality and the primal body of the alphabet. One more thing, and then we'll sort of open this up to questions, which I think is interesting, is that, we haven't really talked about the outside here, and there's a lot of variety of different vignettes that we could talk about. But just going back to this idea of love and Venus powering this system, I think there's also a kind of, if we can say that atoms, if the world is only composed of atoms and void, or the inane and primal bodies, spaces and atoms, he seems to bring in this idea of the domestic. There's these images of homes and cities, and you sort of have this stairwell here. But then you also have this sort of very disturbing picture, which looks almost like a hand that has been partially decapitated, or I guess a hand wouldn't be decapitated because that's reserved for a head, but you get my idea. And there's a reference here to the sort of very sad story of Iphigenia, who, if you know it, it's actually a perfect example, in this case, of the problem with superstition. Iphigenia was promised, it was promised to Iphigenia that she would be wed to Achilles, but it was a ruse, that she was actually going to be sacrificed so that the Greek army could get wind in their sails to go attack Troy. And so, this very sad story of a girl who thinks she's won the love lottery, right? She's going to marry the sort of greatest warrior. And it ends up that, no, she's going to actually be massacred by this sort of the horror, the horrific stupidity of superstition, right? And so this idea of almost a critique of love within this materialist system is afoot within this canvas. So I think I'll just maybe, we're at 12:30, so maybe just open it up to any questions or discussions or insights? Nothing.
So do you have any advice for kind of approaching these works, just because I think they can be very overwhelming when you first see them. So when you were kind of exploring the works, did you kind of pinpoint a person or an idea that you recognized, and then that helped you navigate through the work? Or,
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely both intellectual and meditative objects. So, I mean, for example, this one on our right, which we haven't talked about, you spend a long time just reading it, and the very act of reading, and this is what these maps do. They're meditational objects. So the very act of reading pulls you through that kind of process of lifting one's consciousness to higher realms, if you want to believe that, through really engaging with the materiality of what's there and the different kind of mandalic structures. I mean, we haven't touched at all about the ways in which this is, like a lot of these are related to Tibetan mandalic designs. But just sort of going through word by word and thinking about the correspondences between all of the and how crazily interlocked it all is, right? And just spending time with it, and like I said, being here with an iPhone. I mean, and just searching words. Like I didn't know coming in here. What was the one word that was a little bit weird to me? The kairos. I'd forgotten that, or I didn't really know, because I studied Greek at one point, and it seems to be a basic word, but for some reason I forgot it, and that's what going to old man Google is for, those things you've forgotten or don't know, and I like the realm on the sort of top there. One of the things that I found on the net, which is interesting, is that on the top, it's like second from the top, it's the big black coffin-like shape. It's where we get the word Rerum, but it's also a kind of idea of the underworld where a crow god reigns. So there's a lot of very interesting research that you could do around this, and I chose the canvases that somehow spoke to me more than others. Brian, I know you were originally scheduled to do this, so maybe I'll put you on the spot. I kind of get the sense that there's a lot really, because one of the things that you're interested in is this interpenetration between the literary and the visual arts and the gallery arts, and I'm kind of interested in what you have to say about his particular mix here.
Well, the first thing that strikes me is how colorful all these paintings are, and how crisp the colors are. That's house painting, or these colors, I think of kind of Southern California, Southern culture.
Exactly, yeah.
And so as visual artifacts, the words are so small. The first thing you see is like, is this a spaceman? Or this one looks like a tattoo on somebody's back. And it's closer to like chaos and evil. Is this Satanist? And so so the visuals are one thing, and then you get into the words, and then they become like these strange hyperloop objects that you can spend a lot of time with your smartphone or with a computer. And that if what paintings do is show us the world in a new way, these are about the world as an information system, not about the world as something just perceived and reproduced. So that if you want to reproduce the world, what do you do? Well, you can take your easel out into the outdoors and try to paint what you've seen, and take the camera out and blow up images. Or you can sit down and try to graph everybody's thoughts of how the world works. It's a very strange idea of what it means to reproduce the world. It's very centric in a way. And the kitsch value of these, so that they're both hyper way too intellectualized. And yet, like this is, I was sitting here with my phone trying to remember the guy's name. This is the famous Satanist.
LaVey.
And so you get these references to pop culture. And so it's you could look at this and say, well, it's kind of New Agey because it's a lot of Eastern stuff mashed together with Western alchemy and mysticism. But it takes it so seriously. It's like fanboy alchemy or something. And so they're just very odd objects. Like what is the painter's relationship to the world, to ideas? And as viewers, what do we take away from these kinds of things? The cosmos falls into the chaos as Shakti releases the Ouroboros. What? And then you got this picture of this pinup girl, I suppose it's Shakti, and then this snake Ouroboros, and she's wee. It's funny and strange. So I think it's partly about the world of information and how it is not just intellectual, but can be visualized in this ways that pulls on so many different aspects of life. I like advertisements too.
I like the reference, and like you said, the kitsch for the idea that sort of the day the earth stood still, which there's a lot of references to over there as a kind of mystical text, the sort of B science fiction film as somehow hiding deeper meaning about the way we live in the world. Yeah.
I think one thing that's important to mention, I'm referring to is that precisely taking on what you were saying, that Paul Laffoley really thinks of knowledge as a kind of a non-hierarchical thing. And so in developing his theoretical ideas, because these are all theories, and he says that they function more like a chapter in a meta narrative that he's building, which is this idea of the Bauharoque, which is a period that will come after this era is over, which has the functionality of the Bauhaus, but also the extremes of the Baroque. And I think the works sort of reflect that there's a kind of functional aspect to them, which is the theoretical aspect, which is of course very dense and very difficult to go through. But also there's this kind of visual conundrum. But he's very interested in this sort of this idea of this disciplinary in a way that's completely non-hierarchical. So Wonder Woman is the same as a Greek philosopher because they play a different role in our societal structures, creating new paradigms and opening new narratives. So in part that's and probably when he was here to talk to us and gave a lecture. One of the things that's interesting to hear Paul talk about him, and you can actually Google him or find some videos on YouTube, is that he actually speaks very much like these works are. So he's able to reference different periods, different people to a great degree of detail and depth. So that's just something.
One of the things that you both remind me of, I'm fading a little bit, but is that the art historian who just passed away recently, Thomas McEvilley, talks about the difference between kind of sort of modernist experiments in this vein, for example, like Theosophists or sort of various, like let's not sort of I'm not going to make little containers right now, but the difference between the postmodernist and the modernist, and with somebody like Yves Klein at the tipping point, where sort of Yves Klein was somebody who is really very engaged in he was a Rosicrucian in his practice and in his judo and in his sort of mystical theories of art, but yet he had that kind of trickster element, and that's for him where this kind of like new stage of kind of postmodern spiritualism comes into play. And I think that it's a similar thing that's going on here, is that, and again, whether it's sort of spiritualism or materialism, I would say that distinction might be a little bit moot, but I think that, yes, that element of playfulness and that element of kitsch is definitely a part of what is still seemingly a sort of very, very serious and a seriously painstaking process. Great.
Thanks for coming on the tour, and I hope to see you guys back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.